Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. I'm excited today to continue our journey after Socrates commentary series in which I'm attempting to engage with others in this journey and bridge, make more clear, maybe, at least from one angle, the bridges between what John is trying to do in After Socrates and the person and the tradition following from Christ. So today I'm joined by Jacob Kishere. He's a good friend of mine that we've recently had a few dialogues on Jacob's channel. It's called Sense Space. I'll put the link in the description down below. I think one of the things that I've appreciated so much about you, Jacob, is your sincerity. Something about the way that you engage in the kinds of questions that are pertinent to the depths of spirituality and the pursuit of wisdom and goodness and beauty that I find a deep resonance with, because it seems as if there's different ways to approach and there's different reasons for approaching. And for me, that has to do with a deep kind of felt sense of desire to be in touch, might be one way to say it. And I think that's something that I've sensed in our conversations together. And I think both of us have found that despite the various circumstances of our journeys, we seem to always find ourselves beholding the beauty through the lens of Christ and aspects of the Christian story and the tradition that follows from that. And so I thought it would be quite wonderful to have you join me in this, and particularly for episode 2, Socrates the Monstrous. So thank you for making some time to join me, Jacob.
Thank you, Ken. Really just beautiful words. And can say that I was probably drawn to you for the same reasons. I think that's, underneath whatever my idea was of why I was drawn to you and your channel was kind of those deeper energies, or that deeper kind of indwelling that I saw you participating in or experiencing in dialogue. And that comes from a deep relationship with beauty and a deep dwelling in the present moment. And that's it's really what it's all about. So I'm really excited to get after Socrates today. Dialogos has been really meaningful, important thing for me for the last several years. And Socrates as the progenitor of that in some ways, kind of like something that's coming in more recently for me. Someone who's learned a lot from kind of contemporary philosopher shaman types around this corner of the internet. And the Christianity piece has also been coming in really alive for me as well. So it's an interest we share, and I'm interested about the kind of the blurring of those two as we get into this.
Yeah.
And I want to invite the spirit of Socrates. I don't want to hear about him. Ultimately, I want to meet him through myself and through you. And I don't anticipate that's going to be the same as the guy in ancient Greece. It's going to be whatever that means for you and I.
I think that's very well said, especially and leads very well into this episode, because part of the reason I thought it'd be good to talk with you to discuss this episode is, the title is Socrates the Monstrous, and there's a couple of words that John introduces in the episode that are ways that Socrates describes himself, which is atypos, which is something like there's no category. It's like a monster. It eludes the attempt to categorize. And then Metaxu, which is a betweenness, kind of being in between there's this way in which it seems both of our journeys, and something that I feel deeply and resonate deeply with, is this kind of sense of being in between. And like you're talking about, the kind of ways of overlapping of different models of language, different models of ideas, different teachings, different wisdom traditions. There's a sense in which, for me, the most aliveness has been found in the Metaxu of the various spaces. And so, I remain outside the Christian tradition, though very much inside in another way. And our conversations on your channel have centered around, at least a couple of them have centered around the question of, what does it mean to call yourself a Christian? What is Christianity? And this, so if we're going to presence the spirit of Socrates, what does that mean? What does it mean to presence the spirit of Socrates? I have been listening to this series in a meditative space. So I drop into meditation, and then I have like noise canceling earphones, and kind of try to shut my body down, and just open a space where John comes in and just kind of like builds out these models that allow me to see in and through all these various aspects. And that, to me, in that space, the way Socrates appears is like he's always that piece of your experience that is reminding you that there's more. There's always more, and it's always not what you think it is, no matter what thing you're looking at.
And yeah, and that is monstrous. That's monstrous. I found it really helpful that there were those other phrases as well as monstrous. I think getting hung up on the monstrous is kind of like disgust and these other kind of modern associations of what that means. Villainous, nasty, kind of scary. So as I was like listening to it and reading it, I tried to kind of step outside of my idea of what monstrous is, and maybe like what would like a Greek mythological monstrous vibe be like. And also it seems like he's got a good sense of humor as well. Like he's not using language in that fixed way. And so there's a profound uncertainty, unboxability, it seems to me, about him, and about how he's both intimately engaging with his interlocutors. He's fully there. He's wrestling. He's asking questions, and I really like that you kind of just asked a question. I think that's probably the best way for us to start embodying Socrates. And at the same time, he's elusive, perhaps at an energetic level, or what's I think maybe a good point of orientation is like, what's Socrates experiencing? What ground is he speaking from as he's engaging with his interlocutors? Because that seems to be like where he must be like drawing up where is he drawing up the space of ambiguity in betweenness that he's dwelling in? Where does it live?
Well, Socrates is committed to the good, right? And he, this this way of there's a way of engaging where there's an attempt to delineate this is and this is not, and that has value, certainly. But there's also a way of engaging which requires opening. And in the requirement of opening, or the call to opening, is a call to acknowledge that which is beyond. And that's the thing I think that Socrates never loses sight of, is he never loses sight of that which is beyond. You know, in some sense, that's the ground that he's always working from. It's the wonder, right? One of the things that John, you know, he talks about in this episode is that the way in which Socrates claims that his wisdom lies in that he knows what he does not know, and that he claims not to know, and that's from whence his wisdom comes. But he also he claims to know eros. Claims to know how to love beauty. And then there's this other piece, that beauty educes wonder. And there's a way in which, if I'm properly oriented toward the beautiful, there's never a point at which I will cease to wonder. And I think that's the place, that's the state of being from which Socrates can live in such a space that, you know, John brings up the possibility of the position that you reject Socrates because of the way in which you can't pin him down, right? He doesn't give you a closed system. He doesn't give you a method. And so, you know, he's been dismissed by many people, but he's also willing to die for it. He's willing to die for his commitment to wondering at beauty, to the eros for beauty, something like that.
That's deep.
We're starting off fast here.
Especially when we're thinking also of we're kind of holding the character of Jesus alongside here somewhere as someone else who's willing to die. And in that, like, that to me speaks to like hot, deep hot connection with what he's engaging with, although that doesn't seem to come through as much in the language around the good and the beautiful. That seems to me the organ through which that's occurring. And then it's also soul in some way as well. And it's a curious quality because there are lots of people who are willing to die for causes, people who are very committed to certain things. But this is a kind of commitment that that rests in a deep state of uncertainty at the same time. It's like a profoundly loving, intimate, engaged, but also it's in this wash of mystery at the same time.
Yeah. And this might be a good place. I want to share my screen and play a clip.
I put it to you that following the way of this sage has the real potential to deepen your ability to be a disciple of the sage that you are most trying to internalize. Perhaps even it would be best if you had an inner symphony of sages. One of them can be preeminent. I do not want to call anybody away from a living allegiance that is breathing into them wisdom and orientation towards reality, that's maturing them in virtue. But perhaps a symphony of sages not only will help disclose what any particular sage is, but also allow you to participate in a way of wisdom that allows you to understand not superficial, polite, liberal tolerance or ideological yelling at and not really quite sure you know what it means. Diversity or whatever word you're using, these can be good, they can be bad, but I'm trying to point to something more profound. Could you understand other people's sages such that you could enter into dialogos with them? You don't have to agree with them. They don't have to agree with you. You don't have to come to a conclusion if Socrates is right. But if Socrates is right, that would still be part of the best, maybe the best kind of life we could live with each other.
So what John is trying to get us to understand here is that Socrates doesn't ask us, and John is not asking us, and this whole way of engagement with reality is not asking us to commit or decommit to a particular reference frame. What he's trying to get us to do, and this is, I think, what Socrates is trying to get us to do, is to recognize that recognize the moreness. It's behind us. Oh, it's almost like to question, it's always to question the ground on which you're standing in some sense. And that actually, that doesn't, not only does that not challenge the position of Christianity or Christ, it in fact is deeply, deeply synergistic. Because Christ doesn't give you dialogues on the virtues. He doesn't do a lot of the things that Socrates and the tradition following Socrates does. As a matter of fact, most of Christianity, of the theology and the philosophy in Christianity, brings on board the tools and the concepts and the notions provided by Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and these. And if we get Socrates, one way to think about it is if you get Socrates online in your own mind, if Socrates becomes alive for you, he can teach you things and show you things about Christ and Christianity that are from a different position than you're going to get otherwise.
I'm quite curious for what some of those things are, but I want to just, to share really that for me, my rapprochement and exploration of Christianity has been so coming from the outside and a pretty open-minded place, having gone thoroughly into skeptical rationalism and thoroughly into the phenomenology and ontology of psychedelic experience and meditation and deep nature mystical connection, that I'm not holding things too tightly, and I'm holding a little bit of a place for play in what that relationship is. and I can feel myself entering the places of worship and let's say more like the systems of knowledge and moving through them, but I'm not totally of them. And I'm able to be participating deeply in it, but not absolutely constrained to the boundaries of it. So when John gave this practice of the wonder practice that comes at the end of this episode, talks about, getting into a meditative posture and looking at how, there's so much I do not know. Mm-hmm. And there's so much I cannot see. And because of my faults. And there's so much I don't know about the world. And I'm hearing this as a prayer. And I've been playing with it in prayer. And it quite readily slides into that place for me. Because the process of prayer, I mean, it seems really, if you think about what I rub up against when I'm sitting in the Catholic Church, which I do quite regularly, and I hear the group of congregants reciting the same prayer every single time. To me, that, it's like having the same conversation over and over and over again. The prayer should be fresh. The prayer should be alive. But obviously there are kind of tools and there are kinds of prayers that help us to unlock and open. And these wonderment prayers can do that. And the proof is in the pudding that when I kind of, when I'm contending with something, or I'm not totally connected with myself, or there's something that's potentially cutting me off from wonder because it's so fixed, it's possessing me, there's a passion, there's a struggle. This kind of tool, there's so much I do not know. There's so much I do not understand. And as John says, as a humility, not just a humiliation. And so like an opening outward. And Christianity seems to have this latently, but there's a way in which it's kind of a little bit of a pulling down. It's less like it's maybe not even in the words, it's in the intonation of the words, it's in the vibe and expression of the difference between there's so much I do not see and I am a sinner. And it's like there's such a for me, there's such a fine line and distinction between this deep exploratory engagement in prayer and participating in it as a way to reconnect with wonder, to reconnect with a state of ultimately not knowing, and not knowing as a liberation, not knowing as a being more connected with the beautiful, being more connected with spirit. And so that kind of anecdote is the dovetailing of Socratic and Christian in my life in real time as a consequence of engaging with this series.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I would say my experience is much the same, but from the other side. For me, my upbringing was in a version of Christianity that had totally committed to the absence of wonder. And there's, I watched a clip. I think Karen Wong had of the Meaning Code channel had shared it on Twitter. I watched a clip this morning that was from I believe it was an Orthodox priest talking about how with Thomas Aquinas, the West decided to look at God, the idea of God, and try to write everything down about what was true about it and what wasn't. And then a little bit later, Martin Luther came along and he stood in a different place. And he said, no, you're wrong because you're standing over there. or it's different or whatever. And he wrote down his version, and then, so on and so forth, right? Everybody's looking at the thing and writing down a different thing because you're looking from the place you are. And that orthodoxy avoids that stance altogether by saying, wherever I stand, it's a position. And because of that, I know the goal should be to release those positions such that I see by means and through this thing, and I can talk about it, but it's always held with the position that the words are fundamentally inadequate. And that's that's what Christianity is for me. And maybe it's just my Aquinas and Luther are they're programmed pretty deep for me. I can go underneath them at times, but there's most of my latent programming that runs on what you might call my personality or my belief structure or my cultural whatever. It rests on axioms, which, or you might call them codes. It rests on codes that were written from those perspectives. And so when I am not properly wondering, those tend to come online for me. And so I visited at the local Orthodox church a few times, and at some point I may start attending. I would like to, but I can't do it as long as when I go there, what I feel is an experience is the vibe, as you said, maybe. I think that's a good word. Because it's because you can say those words, right? And you can talk about that position, and then you can say, well, that's the only way to do it, right? And then that can be the vibe with it, right? Is that it's a great pathway. It's a great pathway. But for me, that I'm continually beset by I'm so sensitive. I'm so sensitive to that, like that feeling of a reification of the structure of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I mean, for me, that's fundamental to the notion of sin itself. And so whenever I feel that, whether or not other people are actually attempting to engage it, it like makes me recoil in horror. And I think that's why this figure of Socrates that I've experienced mostly by means of John, and especially this series, is unbelievably healing for me, because it's giving me practices and tools and means by which to re-engage wonder. And maybe at some point that allows me to, maybe that tool becomes strong enough that I can re-engage the Christian tradition. But I think that there's, that's a deep, and that's why, I don't know, a lot of my thoughts and experience in trying to do this commentary series is in some ways just answering that part of myself, because I find it mostly in other people as well. And I'm hopeful that if there's enough reasonable wrestling with that version of ourselves that wants to claim a particular framework at any level, that maybe it provides space to open up wonder as well.
Yeah, as you said that, the word cling also felt very pertinent for me, clinging to and the kind of deep spiritual freedom that I think someone like Socrates or Jesus is embodying is from a place of not clinging, and probably from a continual personal overcoming of that. And I think that's the work for me and for everyone. Not that I'm prescribing it for anyone. Yeah, that frustration you spoke to, Ken, that there's something in that that just rubs, and I can feel it. I probably don't feel it as much as you do these days, but the extent to which I've been able to have this re-engagement has been largely through doing it just with myself, with some of the text, with Augustine, and with prayer and solitude, with the architecture, and with a handful of kind of people who are dwelling in this Metaxu kind of place, who have a leg or two legs in the Christian tradition. But recently, when I'm in the church and I'm going to do my thing, and I hear this group recitation of the same prayers, there's something in the tone and the energy of it that does rub me. And I actually find that it makes it harder for me to connect with God when I can hear that going on, because something about it rubs me and it feels like something's actually constraining and closing in rather than opening up. And so we had this great dialogue with Daniel and Joseph a while back about, am I Christian? And since then, I've felt quite settled in not needing to be Christian in my deep engagement with it. And very quickly, that's turning toward what is the Christianity that goes beyond itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that being not necessarily like, what is Christianity as like the big thing that then includes the other things, but what is Christianity as a big part of an ecology of other things, which are in dialogue with one another. And that seems to be absolutely essential. And the encounter between all of those is going to be mediated by this kind of thing that we're talking about, I think. But it's going to be hard to, it can't be forced. One has to be seduced, probably, by curiosity, and that seems to be what's happened for both of us in some way. I don't know, maybe the frustration and curiosity, but something that draws you out, something that feels more vital, more mysterious. The draw of mystery is the seduction that Socrates maybe is inviting us into, with a goodness somehow in that pursuit, in that shared pursuit.
Yes. Okay, let me try to do a few things, because there's a bunch of things going on for me. So let me try to pull things together, because this notion of seduction has been huge for me recently. I've been thinking about it a lot. Seduction, I think, is the only way to become a means by which someone might come towards beauty. Because the pull towards the beautiful is the movement, and the desire towards the beautiful is eros. And seduction is that which calls forth eros out of another. And I want to tie this. So that's kind of this Socratic Platonic kind of way of talking about it. And I want to tie that directly to Christianity and the story of the fall and Adam and Eve in the garden. There's a great video, I don't know if you've seen it, but on Jordan Peterson's podcast, he had Matthew Pageau on, and they were talking about the symbolism of the fall and these things. And so I'll put a little card to that video and to a particular part of it. But Matthew talks about that the role of the man is to create frames. right? To name the animals. And the role of the woman is to speak for the frame that has been created and call the attention of the man to that which has been left out or that which is inappropriately framed. It's probably the most simple way I can put it. And we're doing this all the time. The masculine and feminine poles of our cognition are doing this all the time. You can roughly map it to the left and right hemisphere of your brain. Or the left hemisphere of your brain is saying, yep, this is a phone. I know what this is. There it is. And the right hemisphere of your brain is always calling to you that there's more to there. You're missing something, right? Or there's things that need to be incorporated, is another way to think of it. And that voice, when it's working properly, is a seductive voice, calling you to wonder at the beauty. Because there's always more beauty in whatever frame than has been framed. And that's the role, that's what Socrates is doing, right? Socrates, he certainly builds fantastic frames, but he also is continually breaking frames in a way that is attempting to call people, to seduce them towards the beauty behind it. And one way to say what we've been trying to say about the Christian tradition is that it's become so masculine. And I think this is what people mean, even though there's so many issues with this term, but the term toxic masculinity basically refers to this, right? An overcommitment to a stabilized frame. And that I'm not saying you don't need to frame things. You have to frame things. You have to create the garden. You have to build the garden. But you have to also be updating it all the time. And yeah, so I think that's a decent way to pull together the way in which Socrates offers us a toolkit and a way of engaging. And he offers us himself. He offers us himself. If you install Socrates into your operating system of your mind, he will walk with you, and he will call your attention to the way in which you are overly fitting to the data. You're overly committed to your frame.
I feel called in hearing that to a greater possibility of that Socrates integration for myself. Because whilst I certainly kind of engage in that Socratic pivot of I'm in the frame, there's a move that's opening the frame or sensing the boundaries of the frame that I'm in, and having had frame breaking experiences a number of times is a really, really effective way of getting an embodied remembrance that there's more than the frame you're in. So some sort of experiential spirituality, experiential psychedelic journeying or what have you seems to be an important piece to this, as well as what we're doing here. But I don't yet have Socrates as a figure that I can call on. For me, he's still distant, he's still kind of in the text somewhere. There's an echo coming through. There's something coming through. It's alive in my understanding of dialogos, and that's become a part of myself. But Jesus, on the other hand, has come in a much more personal way, like you describe, of I can feel him, I can orient toward him, and if I do that deeply enough, I can more or less start to see him too. And so that is I a beautiful, beautiful idea of having you know, a symphony of extra metaphysical sage-like figures that are guiding my compass in how I orient in my day-to-day life. Okay, there's a couple more things I want to add too. I think your model of Christianity as taking a masculine, toxic masculine is it's fitting. Especially for me, if we consider about 2 generations back, kind of Christianity that my grandparents grew up with, that is like you can see a really close mapping between the kind of men that you had at that time and what it meant to be a father at that time, and laying down the rules and what we consider kind of arbitrary tyrannical authority of just like, this is what is, and you absolutely cannot question it, and if you question it, you'll be punished or subject to violence. And that was kind of the role of the patriarch in some ways, in the shadow side of it, and also the church in its shadow at that time. There's some Christianity that's like that today. I would say actually what we have is kind of a hollowed out progressively, where it's still masculine. It still thinks that it knows exactly what is, but it doesn't have that overriding strong conviction. It's moved into more of a softer masculinity that wants to try and integrate itself with what's going on in the culture and be this more kind of friendly liberal Christianity. And that is also off-putting for a lot of people, I think, especially in kind of Church of England context. There's a feeling of just like, oh, this just lacks substance, this lacks conviction at all. And you can tell that it's not drawing forth wonder and beauty because the style of preaching and expressing about the gospel is so monotonous and homogenous wherever you go in a church in England. It's like a learned style. It's like we've all learned to play music in the same way. And there's what's needed is like a Jimi Hendrix kind of figure to come through, or a few Jimi Hendrixes. And that's the feminine who's going to like be in the framework of what it means to play guitar. Obviously, Jimmy knew the whole lineage of guitar music up to that time, but he's going beyond the bounds of it, and he's showing that there's way more dimensions of beauty here. So when I'm in the church, I'm thinking to myself as I hear this very repetitive, some ways constricted expression of spirit, what would be like the genuine, authentic, particular, unique expression of that person? Were they in touch with it, giving life to those words? And I want to talk more about the seduction, but I've already laid out quite a bit here. So,
well, I would say to that,
yeah,
I think there's a way in which you, at least for me, I understand all of the fragmentation that starts in philosophy and then trickles down into all of culture from, say, whatever point you want to put on it as a start date. Let's say roughly, we'll say Martin Luther, right? There's a before Martin Luther, you have this very clear-cut structure. And then it starts to fragment and fracture and open, right? But the way in which it does that, this isn't always the case. There's all kinds of exceptions, but the general rule has been that there's been a doubling down on some level of authority. And there's a whole issue for me with any argument from authority, but I won't go into that now. But it has to do with all of this. And it's that if I'm maintaining a structure and I'm not allowing for the snake, which is always inside the structure, there's always a snake. The snake in the Pageauian sense of the cyclical nature of time and the always moreness, right? The ever the infinitude of reality that you cannot contain. And there's a way in which all the fragmentation that's happened and all the secularization, the skepticism, and all of this is a manifestation of the way in which the snake has not been properly integrated. Because when you don't properly integrate the snake, it begins to bite you. And the more it bites you, the worse it hurts. And there's a way in which, we live in a world now where we glorify and worship self-mutilation based on a commitment to a personal autonomy, which itself is based on a claim of particular individual identity and willpower. And because we're so committed to that, this disease that has come from the bite of the snake, you might say, of, let's call it broadly, postmodernism, and that the good is the expression of the arbitrary will, that we actually engage in deep physical suffering. And I'm referring specifically to gender transitions. When you think about a young person going through a gender transition, and it's so unbelievably painful to look at, because you should never look at it from the outside, right? You should take the position of the person. And it's so unbelievably painful to feel yourself in a world that is only arbitrary power structures that crush you, and the only tool you have is to try to express yourself onto the world in any way that you can. And apparently the only agency you have left is to just cause yourself physical, personal trauma. And that is so sad. And there's a way in which, there's something in there, and I'm not going to claim I know what it is, but there's something in there that is, it's still Eve calling to Adam. It's still Eve calling to Adam and saying, there's a way in which you haven't properly integrated, right? There's still frames. And I'm broadly drawing an analogy of postmodernism to the church, right? Eve is Eve in the 14-year-old girl who's now becoming a boy, is Eve calling to Adam, who's, let's say, the Pope of the church or whatever thing you want to take as the figurehead there, and saying, you've named me improperly. There's something wrong here. And there's, an infinite expanse of space in which that work has to be done. But it just, okay, that's a lot. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, a lot of pieces for me to hold in this moment. And I'm not going to attempt to collapse them into something that is yet clear. The first thing that was coming up for me in that, when you spoke about self-mutilation, was not the physical self-mutilation that in some cases going through that transition can be, just horrible. I have a lot of compassion for for that. But rather the mutilation of the self, the cutting off of parts of the self, the rejection of parts of the self. And the relationship that Christians have to the snake has been set up as this satanic, evil thing that has to be rejected. And that kind of maps onto the relationship to that which is outside of the safety of Christianity. And this kind of creates a high dependency cultural context in which there's kind of like, we're in here, and then don't get tempted by the evil one. And I was recently talking with my mom, because she's kind of going through deconstruction in her 50s of the church she was involved in her 20s. And like, it's coming as a shock to me that this kind of language was just around, because I just saw the happy, friendly faces. I didn't understand some of these nefarious ideas that were there. But this is really interesting to me, because actually that's kind of like an inverse of the seduction. This is like a firewall to prevent, because we're unsafe. And Ken's coming in here or Socrates is coming in here, or with the Pharisees, Jesus is coming in here with something that's not safe. It's not safe for the fully walled garden, or whatever metaphor for the tightly constrained. And so it's banished and it's targeted, and that prevents people from the seduction of the beauty that's potentially there as well. One of the things that really struck me, I've been reading the Gonzalez book on dialectic that John recommends. I'm a little way into it. And in chapter 2 or 3, I think it's on the Laches, it talks about Socrates is in the marketplace, and this dialogue kind of comes about, and this young man has come, this young kind of swashbuckling young Athenian has come, and he's wearing this loose garment, and Socrates is almost overwhelmed by his lust for this other man's beauty. And this is not in a completely like exalted abstract sense or appreciation of the flowers. It's pretty clear Socrates has that, he's a little bit of a dog. He's got that fully erotic charge is integrated with him as part of it. So this is really interesting for me when we're making the kind of Socrates Jesus comparison, because Jesus has been lifted up so high into the clouds that we don't see him as having any of those kinds of carnal aspects. And yet at the same time, the kingdom of heaven is here. It is through carnal reproduction that it is constantly emerging into reality. It is through love that we're communing with one another, and as physical embodied beings that, has a carnal aspect. So this is tricky stuff, and it feels really close for me, because I'm in a place in my life where I've got passions and anger and jealousy and like these kinds of energies coming through. And perhaps if I were in that Christian frame, I would reject it somehow, or I would try and like put it outside the garden. And I think that there's another way of holding these things. I think like that these parts of self can be held, but they need to be tempered. There has to be temperance. This is another one of the virtues that Socrates talks about. And so it's kind of like how to hold these elements that have this danger to them, have this feminine aspect to them, have this potential to create chaos. whilst still undergoing that frame opening again and again and again of I do not know, I don't know everything. I can't see everything.
Yeah, I think of how you brought up the fact that Jesus became real for you, and Socrates hasn't in the same way. And I had a similar kind of experience. Jesus became real for me in the sense of being an alive figure with whom I can engage at any point before Socrates. And there's this way in which following Christ, Christ, like you said, Jesus, he disappears into the clouds. You can't ever find the end of it. And but he also will come with you and pick you up in the bottom of your deepest pit. And he's right there with you. But he's so darn good all the time. Like he's perfect all the time, regardless of the level at which you are. And it becomes very easy, and easy is not the right word. There's this underlying sense of judgment that I hold for myself because of the transcendence of Christ, and my attempts to follow him are always falling short. And it's so pernicious, that judgment of myself. This is one of the things that is so nice about having Socrates online now. Because Socrates, he disappears, but it's not exactly into the clouds the way Jesus does. He just kind of disappears everywhere. He'll disappear underneath you or behind you or in front of you. Like he's always, but you don't have the same sense that he doesn't have that perfection, right? He has that, like, it's kind of a dog, right? In that way you said, like, and there's a way in which that it quiets some of that self-judgment. And again, I'm not pinning that on Christ. Christ has never judged me. Jesus has never judged me. I've never felt that from him. But it's the same way in which, you look at that person, like think of the best and kindest person, the most wonderful person that you know, and how man, it's just kind of annoying that they're such a good person all the time. Like there's a way in which they're so wonderful that you just cannot forget that you're not that. And that element of, Socrates has allowed me to engage with Jesus so much more deeply. And they're great friends. They have, there's hilarious kind of conversations that happen between them. But it allows for an opening that, especially cognitively, there's a way in which, in Christianity, there's such a de-emphasis, not all Christianity, but a lot of Christianity, there's almost like a condescension vibe, right? It's like, well, you'll never get there, and here's all the people that have gone before, and and here's all the exercises, work on the exercises and you'll get somewhere. And it's not like that's wrong, right? That comes from a good place, and it's like, by no means am I going to claim that I'm a saint, right? There are people that are, it's not, this isn't about me. But the vibe that you get is like, you're continually always the wretch. And that's always, like you said, that's always the thing to be fought against. It's always the thing to be excluded. It's always the thing to be, Whereas, I don't know, since Socrates has come more online for me, it's like that's
Yeah. How you can imagine the Christian approaching Socrates. It's like, yes, I'm a sinner. I know I'm a sinner. Socrates would be like, are you sure? Like, how sure are you of that?
yeah.
And so what I'm hearing in it is almost like Christianity, you have this, at least for me, you have this like heart channel to Christ, and it's supported by this whole tradition, but that doesn't necessarily always break you out of the mental prison. Like you can be in heartfelt prayer and you can even be making some progress with your prayer, but you're still in the same cognitive frame. And what Socrates, it sounds like, is offering you is this other jailbreak where like the walls of the mental frame just open up, and it's kind of it's almost like a different dimension of opening. Like there's a opening of the heart, and then there's like a kind of embodied mind frame knowing dissolution. But when we couple the two together, it's a pretty good place to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you, Jacob. This has been wonderful. I know that you had something else you wanted to talk about. I think we're drawing near the end of our time, but if you still have that other thing or anything else, I would love to hear.
No, I don't think that I do at this present moment. I'm just really really, it's just incredible to me how much movement and progressive like shift in realization and orientation is happening for me in each of these dialogues. Like it really, like there's whole pieces on the board that are moving. And so the dialogues I'm having with you and Daniel and others are consequential and real time to my ability to break out of the prisons and reframe and integrate the passions and so on. And I really feel that this place of uncertain synthesis of Christian energy, of Socratic energy, and I would say, you know, of the shamanic energy of that piece as well, for me fits in there and plays that role of breaking open. So this is an incredible time to be exploring, and we have a lot of urgent need to do so. So I'm really thankful.
Yeah, I agree.
And thankful to John as well for putting this on and going on the journey he's been on. And man, I'm so impressed at how many books he's read. And yeah.
Yeah, I said in the first episode, and I found it, I only find it to be more true the more I get to actually engage with John, is that I follow Christ and John is my teacher. Yeah, that's so. Thank you, Jacob. Always appreciate your insight and authenticity, and you bring such a wonderful kind of spirit to a space, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you for coming.
Well, your friendship's a great gift. So thank you.